Henry Whitman strode through Terminal 5 of Denver International Airport with the precision of someone who measured his life in billable hours. The polished leather of his shoes clicked against the floor as his tailored suit reflected his position as one of the most sought-after corporate lawyers in the country. His briefcase, packed with legal briefs for a high-profitable trial, swung rhythmically as he checked his Rolex, a ritual as constant as the sunrise. Henry had carefully cultivated his reputation, a relentless litigator, immune to distractions and laser-focused on success. But as he approached the gate for his flight, a voice cut through the ambient noise of the terminal. "Why did you leave us?" The words froze him mid-step. He turned to see a young girl standing a few feet away. Her blue eyes locked on his, unyielding, her messy braid and worn backpack a stark contrast to the immaculate image of the man before her. "I'm sorry, what?" Henry said, his voice faltering slightly. The girl clutched the strap of her backpack tighter. "Why did you leave us, Dad?" In that moment, Henry's carefully constructed world cracked at the edges. Henry stared at the girl, his mind racing for an explanation. This had to be a mistake, some sort of misunderstanding. He took a step back, his grip tightening on his briefcase. "You must have me confused with someone else," he said, his voice regaining its practiced calm. "No," the girl insisted, pulling something from her backpack. "Mom keeps this in her drawer. She said I'd need it one day." She held out a worn photograph, and the air seemed to leave Henry's lungs. It was a picture of him, 10 years younger, standing with a woman he hadn't thought about in years. Sarah. Her arm was looped through his, and they were smiling in front of a park bench. He remembered the day vividly, though he had buried the memory deep beneath years of legal victories and promotions. How did you find me?" Henry asked, his voice faltering. Ella's face brightened with a hint of pride. "Aunt Rachel works at a travel agency," she said, gripping the strap of her backpack tighter. "She saw your name on the passenger list for this flight. I overheard her talking to Mom about it last night." Henry's jaw tightened. Of course, Rachel would still have an eye on him, even after all these years. "So, I woke up early this morning and came here," Ella continued, her voice growing softer. "Mom doesn't know I'm here. Nobody does." Henry blinked, unable to process the weight of her words. A child, no older than 8, had navigated her way through one of the busiest airports in the country, alone, just to find him. "Ella, you shouldn't be here by yourself," Henry said, his tone sharp with concern. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" "I had to," she replied, her eyes filling with tears. "Mom said you needed to know. She said this might be our last chance." Ella pulled a crumpled envelope from her dress pocket and handed it to him. His name, written in Sarah's familiar handwriting, stared back at him. His fingers trembled as he took it, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. "Mom said you need to read this," Ella said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, it's important." Henry hesitated, glancing toward the gate where his flight was boarding. His career demanded his presence, but something deeper, more primal, held him there. "Let's sit down," he said finally, leading Ella to a row of nearby seats. His hands shook as he tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its edges soft from being folded and unfolded. As he read Sarah's words, the chaos of the terminal faded into a dull hum. As Henry read Sarah's letter, memories he had worked so hard to suppress came flooding back. The words on the page blurred as his mind took him to another time, another life. One where Sarah had been his anchor. 10 years earlier, Henry had just landed a partnership at a prestigious law firm. His ambition was unrelenting, and his days revolved around courtrooms, contracts, and late-night strategy sessions. Sarah, his girlfriend at the time, was his opposite in every way, warm, grounded, and deeply empathetic. She had been an artist, painting vivid landscapes inspired by her travels. "Henry, you're never home," she had said one night, sitting on the couch of their small apartment. Her hands, often smudged with paint, were clasped tightly in her lap. "This case is critical, Sarah," he had replied, barely glancing up from his laptop. "Once it's over, things will calm down. I promise." But the promises always remained unfulfilled. Their breaking point had come during a chilly autumn evening. Henry had come home late, again, and found Sarah sitting silently on the edge of their bed, a stack of papers in her hands. "Are these yours?" she had asked, her voice steady but laced with hurt. Henry's heart sank when he recognized the divorce papers he had carelessly left in his briefcase. "Sarah, it's not what you think." "It is exactly what I think," she interrupted, standing up. "You've already checked out of this relationship, haven't you? I'm just a distraction, a liability in your perfect plan for success." "That's not true," he had protested weakly. "Then fight for us, Henry," she said, her green eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Show me that we still matter to you." But Henry, ever the pragmatist, had remained silent. His career consumed him, and he had convinced himself that letting Sarah go was the best decision for both of them. Back in the airport, Henry blinked away the memory and returned to Sarah's letter. "When you left, I was 6 weeks pregnant," the letter read. "I thought about calling you, telling you about Ella, but I couldn't bear the thought of her being just another obligation in your busy schedule." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had lost not only Sarah, but also the chance to know his daughter during her earliest years. "I built a life for Ella and me," the letter continued. "It wasn't easy, but every smile she gave me made it worthwhile. Now, Henry, I'm asking for one thing. Be the father she deserves. Not your money or your name, just you." Henry folded the letter slowly, his hands trembling. Ella was watching him, her expression a mix of hope and fear. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. For the first time in years, Henry didn't have an answer. Henry sat in silence, staring at the letter in his hands. Around him, the noise of the terminal surged and ebbed like waves, but it barely registered. Sarah's words echoed in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. "Ella," he began hesitantly, looking down at the girl beside him. "Does your mom know you're here?" Ella shook her head, clutching her backpack tightly. "No. Aunt Rachel was talking about you last night, and I overheard her say which flight you'd be on. I woke up early and snuck out before anyone noticed." Tammy raised an eyebrow. "You shouldn't have done that. It's dangerous for a kid to be alone in an airport." "I had to," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. Mom talks about you a lot, you know. Even when she tries not to. She keeps your picture in her drawer, the one from when you and her went to the park. She says she doesn't want me to be angry at you, but sometimes I think she misses you." Henry's chest tightened at her words. The memory of that day in the park, the laughter, the simplicity, was one of the few times he could recall ever feeling truly happy outside of work. Ella looked down at her lap, her fingers fidgeting with the frayed strap of her backpack. "Mom's really sick, Dad," she said, her voice trembling now. "She doesn't say much about it, but I hear her talking to Aunt Rachel. The doctors are trying, but..." She trailed off, her small shoulders heaving as she tried to hold back tears. "They said she might not have much time," Ella continued, her voice breaking. "Mom said she didn't want to bother you, that you were probably too busy. But I thought, if you knew, maybe you'd want to come." The words hit Henry like a freight train. He glanced again at the gate where passengers were boarding his flight. This trial was supposed to be one of the biggest cases of his career, the kind that would cement his legacy. But none of it seemed to matter anymore. Henry pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant. "Lucy, cancel my appearance at the trial," he said firmly, cutting through her protests. "Tell the team to proceed without me." He hung up before she could respond and turned to Ella. "Where's the hospital?" Ella's tear-streaked face lit up with relief. "It's not far. We can take a cab." The cab ride was quiet at first, with Ella staring out the window and Henry lost in thought. Finally, she broke the silence. "Do you think Mom will be happy to see you?" she asked softly, her voice filled with cautious hope. Henry hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's been a long time. She always says you were the smartest person she ever met," Ella said, her tone wistful. "She says you could solve anything if you wanted to." Henry's throat tightened. "Your mom always saw the best in people," he replied, his voice heavy. Ella tilted her head, her blue eyes filled with a mixture of innocence and determination. "Do you think you'll make her smile again? She doesn't smile much anymore." Henry looked at her, his heart aching. "I'll try," he said finally. When they arrived at the hospital, Henry felt his heart pounding. The sterile smell and muted beeping of machines brought back memories he hadn't expected, visiting his own mother in her final days, promising himself he'd never let personal connections distract him again. But as Ella led him through the hallways, Henry realized how misguided that promise had been. "She's in room 412, Ella said, stopping in front of a door. Henry hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. He took a deep breath, then opened the door. The door creaked open, and Henry stepped inside, his heart racing. The room was bathed in the soft light of the afternoon sun filtering through the blinds. On the hospital bed, Sarah lay propped against a sea of white pillows. Her once vibrant features were thinner, her skin pale, and her hair cropped short, ravaged by the treatments she'd endured. But her green eyes, though tired, retained the same spark of intelligence and warmth he'd remembered so well. Sarah looked up as the door closed behind him. For a moment, her expression was unreadable, a mixture of surprise, disbelief, and something he couldn't quite name. Then a small, wry smile curved her lips. "Henry," she said softly, "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Henry froze, guilt clawing at him. The weight of 10 years of silence pressed down on him. "Sarah," he managed, his voice hoarse. Mom," Ella interrupted, darting past Henry to Sarah's bedside. She climbed onto the bed carefully, wrapping her small arms around her mother's frail frame. "I brought him. I told you he'd come." Sarah chuckled lightly, wincing as she adjusted herself to embrace her daughter. "You've always been persistent, haven't you?" she said, brushing a hand over Ella's messy braid. Henry stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of how to proceed. Finally, he cleared his throat. Ella found me at the airport," he explained, his voice faltering. She told me everything." Sarah's gaze turned to him again, softer this time. "She always believed you'd come back," she said quietly, "even when I wasn't so sure." Henry took a hesitant step forward. "Sarah, I didn't know," he began, his voice thick with regret. If you had told me about Ella, you would have done what?" Sarah interrupted gently. There was no anger in her tone, just a calm curiosity that cut through his defenses. "I would have been there," Henry said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "I would have tried to do the right thing," Sarah finished for him. She sighed, leaning back against the pillows. "Henry, I didn't tell you because I didn't want Ella to be another task on your to-do list. She deserved more than that. And honestly, I wasn't sure you were ready for her." Henry felt the sting of her words, but couldn't deny the truth in them. He had been so consumed by his career, by the endless pursuit of success, that he had let the most important parts of his life slip away. "Maybe I wasn't ready then," he admitted, his voice low. "But I am now. I want to be here. For Ella. For you." Sarah's eyes softened, and she reached out a trembling hand. Henry stepped closer, taking it in his own. Her grip was weak, but the connection felt strong. "It's not about making up for lost time," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about being present now. She needs you, Henry, and so do I." As the afternoon stretched on, the three of them talked quietly. Ella sat on the bed, her small hand never leaving her mother's. Henry listened as Sarah recounted Ella's milestones. The first steps he had missed, the birthday parties he hadn't known about, the little victories that had defined their lives. Each story was a reminder of what he had lost, but also of what he still had a chance to gain. Eventually, Sarah's strength waned and her eyes began to flutter shut. Ella kissed her cheek gently, sliding off the bed. "Is Mom going to get better?" she asked Henry softly, her blue eyes wide and searching. Henry knelt down to her level, his throat tightening. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said honestly. "But whatever happens, I'm here. We'll get through it together." Ella nodded, her small hand slipping into his. For the first time in years, Henry felt something he thought he'd lost, a sense of purpose, anchored in the love of the two people who mattered most. 2 weeks later, the day Henry had been dreading arrived. The funeral was held at a small chapel nestled on the outskirts of town. The air was crisp, and the sun shone faintly through a thin veil of clouds, as though even the sky mourned. Henry stood silently near the entrance, dressed in a black suit, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Around him, a small group of friends and family had gathered. Despite the solemn atmosphere, Ella stood out, her posture impossibly composed. She wore a simple black dress and clutched a single sunflower, Sarah's favorite flower, in her small hands. As the service began, the officiant spoke gently about Sarah's life, her kindness, her unwavering strength, and the love she had poured into raising Ella. Each word felt like a bittersweet tribute to the woman Henry had once loved deeply, and whom he had failed in so many ways. When the officiant asked if anyone wanted to share a few words, Henry hesitated. He had prepared a short speech, but the weight of what he wanted to say seemed overwhelming. Before he could move, Ella stepped forward, clutching a folded piece of paper. The room fell silent as she approached the podium, standing on tiptoe to reach the microphone. "Mom always said stories were magic," she began, her small voice steady but tinged with emotion. "She said they could take us to special places when we were sad. So, I wrote a story for her." Unfolding the paper, Ella took a deep breath and began to read. "Once upon a time, there was a warrior princess named Sarah," she said. "She didn't fight with swords or shields, but with love. Her superpower was making people smile, even when she was tired or sad. She worked really hard, but she always had time to read bedtime stories, make pancakes, and paint pictures that looked like they were alive." Ella paused, her voice trembling slightly as she continued. "One day, the warrior princess got very sick, but she didn't stop fighting, not for herself, but for her little princess, who she loved more than anything. And before she went to the stars, she did something magical. She brought back a king who had been lost for a long time." The congregation listened in rapt silence, many dabbing at their eyes as Ella's words filled the room. "Now the little princess is sad because her warrior is gone," Ella said, her voice cracking slightly. "But she knows the warrior is watching from the stars, making the sky brighter. And she knows that the king is learning how to be a king again. She knows she's not alone anymore." Ella folded the paper carefully, holding it to her chest. "The end. Or maybe just the beginning," she finished, stepping down from the podium. There wasn't a dry eye in the room as Ella returned to her seat. Henry knelt down and pulled her into a hug, his throat too tight to speak. For the first time, he realized how much strength this little girl had. Strength she had inherited from her mother. As the service ended and the guests began to leave, Ella lingered near the steps of the chapel, staring at the sunflower in her hands. "That was a beautiful story," Henry said softly, sitting beside her. "Mom always said the best stories are true ones," Ella replied, plucking a petal from the sunflower. She glanced at him, her expression serious. "Daddy, are you going to stay, or are you going to leave again?" Henry felt his heart constrict. He took her small hand in his. "Ella, look at me," he said gently. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I promise." "But what about your work?" she asked. "Your important meetings?" Henry shook his head. "Nothing is more important than you," he said, his voice filled with conviction. Ella studied him for a moment before nodding. She placed the sunflower on the chapel steps and leaned against his shoulder. The day after the funeral, Henry and Ella stood in the middle of an empty apartment on the Upper West Side. The space was airy and filled with light, with large windows that overlooked Central Park. "What do you think?" Henry asked, watching Ella as she explored the rooms. She paused in the living room, tracing her fingers along the white walls. "It's nice," she said quietly, "but it doesn't feel like home yet." Henry nodded. "That's because it's our job to make it one," he said. "We can decorate it together, pick out furniture, paint the walls, anything you want." Ella's eyes lit up slightly. "Can we paint constellations on this wall?" she asked, pointing to a blank space. "Mom and I always wanted to, but the landlord at the old place wouldn't let us." Henry smiled. "We can do whatever you want," he said. "This is our home now. And can I have a corner for my science projects?" Ella added, her tone more hopeful. Henry gestured toward a smaller room with wide windows. "Actually, I thought this could be your lab," he said. Ella's eyes widened as she peeked inside. "My own lab?" she whispered, as if it were too good to be true. "On one condition," Henry said, crouching to her level. "You have to teach me everything you know about renewable energy. I think Rochester Law might need a new consultant for environmental cases." Ella grinned for the first time in days, the expression so much like Sarah's that it made Henry's heart ache. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments. Mornings, once reserved for strategy calls and espresso shots, now began with Ella's favorite breakfast: pancakes. Henry's early attempts at cooking were disastrous, resulting in burned batter and batter-splattered counters. But Ella's laughter made every failed lip worth it. "That one looks like Saturn," Ella exclaimed one morning, pointing to a particularly lopsided pancake. Henry laughed along, flipping another. "And this one looks like my legal career after last month," he joked, holding up a charred one. As they settled into their new routine, Henry found himself learning more than just how to cook. He learned how to braid Ella's hair, a skill he picked up from hours of YouTube tutorials, and discovered her favorite books, movies, and even her knack for solving complex problems with the ease of a budding engineer. One afternoon, while Henry was working on a brief at the dining table, Ella joined him with a stack of newspaper clippings. "Look," she said, spreading them out. "I saved these. They're about you." Henry stared at the clippings, each one detailing a case he had won or a speech he had given. "Why do you have these?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom helped me cut them out," Ella said, her tone proud. "She always said one day you'd be proud of me too." Henry felt his chest tighten. "Ella," he said, pulling her close, "I already am." Life wasn't without its challenges. Some mornings, Ella woke up crying for Sarah, and Henry struggled to comfort her while dealing with his own grief. But slowly, they began to find their rhythm. Henry made changes to his work schedule, conducting meetings remotely to ensure he was always home for dinner. He even created a corner in his office for Ella, complete with a small desk and a corkboard for her projects. Little by little, braid by braid, project by project, Henry and Ella were building a life together. 1 month after Sarah's funeral, Henry found himself sitting on the balcony of their new apartment, watching Ella tend to the small garden they had planted together. The sunflowers she insisted on growing, her mother's favorite, were beginning to bloom. Ella looked up from her work, brushing dirt off her hands. "Do you think Mom would like it here?" she asked. Henry nodded, his throat tightening. "I think she'd love it," he said. "Especially the sunflowers." The balcony was quiet for a moment, save for the distant hum of the city below. Then Ella spoke again, her voice soft but steady. "Do you miss her?" Henry hesitated before answering. "Every day," he admitted, "but when I look at you, it feels like she's still here. You remind me of her so much." Ella smiled faintly. "She always said you'd come back one day," she said. "Even when I didn't think you would." Henry reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he said. "But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." That night, after tucking Ella into bed, Henry sat at his desk and opened a drawer. Inside was a photo Sarah had left for him, tucked into the envelope of her final letter. It was a picture of her, radiant and smiling, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. "Even in the hardest times, I never regretted having our daughter," her letter had said. "She's the best of both of us. Don't let fear or guilt stop you from being the father she deserves." Henry placed the photo on his desk, where it would serve as a daily reminder of what truly mattered. If you had to choose between maintaining your career and rebuilding a family relationship, what would you choose? Henry's story reminds us that true success isn't measured in wealth or achievement, but in the love we share with those closest to us. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know your thoughts and share your reflections below.